Good morning, New Break. How y'all doing? Good. Everybody's good? I'm going to sound a little nasally this morning. I was out sick all week, but I'm at 80%, but now I'm going to ramp it to 100, okay? You guys with me? Good. So one of the things I was thinking about this week is when we communicate to people, sometimes we have to communicate, well, some tough stuff, right? Sometimes when it's our kids or a coworker or an employee, we have to communicate things that sometimes require guidance or correction. And, it's difficult sometimes to do that. And what I've learned is that not only when it comes to those times of communicating, it's not just what we have to communicate, but how we communicate that. The method by which we communicate the hard news. And so I want to tell you a recipe I use that's been very helpful. I call it the love sandwich. The love sandwich. So the love sandwich has two pieces of bread and the meat in the middle. And the sandwich, the bread, is first of all, you tell somebody something positive first, right? So you tell them something positive about them, about maybe something that's a character trait for them. And I don't mean like in a schmarmy sales way, but for real. Like tell them something positive about them. And then you give them the meat, right? You give them the hard stuff, the correction, the guidance. And then you slap the other piece of bread on there, which is something, again, positive about them. And I've found this has been very helpful in a number of circumstances, whether it's an employee or to an employer, your neighbor with the barking dog, your spouse, your kids. Generally, the love sandwich works best face-to-face, but sometimes you have to do this via email. Now, if you're like me, when I have an email I need to fire off to somebody, what I'll do is I'll pop open the box and I'll just write what I need to write and then stop and go, okay, that was the meat. So then I'll go do the intro, put the sandwich meat bread on there. Then I'll do the closing. And then usually by then I've calmed down a little bit. And so then I can kind of tool the meat, take out any inflammatory language or anything that's in there that might not convey. Again, it's about message sent, hopefully message received. And so kind of do that a little bit. And what I've found is, you guys know that takes a lot more time, right, than just firing the email. Some of you guys are like, just let's get this done. Fire that email off, right? What I've found is when you take those few extra minutes, it usually saves me 2 to 4 hours per email. How, you ask? Well, when I just fire the email, then I have to have 18 follow-up emails on what I really meant, plus 2 phone calls, plus an hour-long meeting, face-to-face with the person, to explain I wasn't being mean, right? Yeah, some of you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. Don't look like you're all innocent. You know what I'm talking about, right? So the love sandwich, it's a very good way to communicate something that's important to an employee that maybe has a brilliant idea and they're creative and they're like, I got this great idea, and you're listening to it and you're like, that's going to cost half of the year's annual budget. So you don't tell them, well, that was stupid. That's a dumb idea. No, you say, listen, here's the sandwich. Ready? I love that you're creative and that you're thinking out of the box and you're thinking about this place, bringing a new product to market. That's awesome. I don't know if you realize this, but this idea is going to cost half the annual budget. So help me think through that. Maybe there's a creative way that you could raise money so that we can do that, or a way to cut costs. Again, I love your creativity. Keep doing it. There's the love sandwich. Or with your kids. Here's an example of the love sandwich with your kids. I love the passion you have about this particular subject. You have got all over the internet on it. You've researched out about it. You're talking about it. You got it all memorized, every album they ever came out with, right? You're like, this is amazing. However, could you take some of that, harness some of that passion and put it into math, English, Spanish, right? Your homework. I know you can do it because you're smart. That's the love sandwich. You guys following me now? We all up on the love sandwich? We are in this series called All In. And Malachi, are going through the book of Malachi. He's a prophet. A prophet is a guy who speaks the words of God to the people of God, and he's about to give and serve up an amazing love sandwich today in this passage. And so I want to read just for a minute Malachi chapter 1, verse 1. This is our second week in the series. We started this last week. And he says this, it says, a prophecy, the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. And he says this first thing in verse 2. I have loved you, says the Lord. Oh yeah, this is it. It's going down. Here comes the sandwich. There's the bread. Now, again, it's for real. What he's telling the people is, yeah, no, God does love you. Like, I've loved you. My love's unconditional. So Malachi is getting ready to tell the people about something very serious, very important. He's going to bring the meat. And so he starts with saying, like, the Lord, I love you. And here's the crazy thing. The people that he's delivering this message to, they don't even let him get to the meat. They want to argue the bread. They just right off the top want to argue the bread. They say in verse 2, well, how have you loved us? He doesn't even get past the bread, and they're already like wanting to argue with him and argue with God and his love. And part of the problem is because their hearts, as we will get into this book of Malachi, their hearts had drifted and become hard toward God. And so the question we're asking this week is, what happens when it comes to our relationships, when it comes to us allowing our hearts to drift from God? Because absolutely, our relationship with God, that vertical relationship, 100% always affects our horizontal relationship with everyone that we come in contact. Always, always, always. So if you were not here last week, I want to do something for you. I want to bring you up to speed on what the book of Malachi is all about. There is this great group called the Bible Project that does these summaries of the books of the Bible in an illustrated form, and it's really awesome. And so I want to show you this and just kind of bring us up to speed today, because we're in Malachi chapter 2. And you can turn there during this, but I want you to watch this summary of the book of Malachi and where we're headed.
The book of the prophet Malachi. He lived about 100 years after the Israelites had returned from their Babylonian exile, and his message was directed to the people who had been living in Jerusalem for some time now. The temple had been rebuilt a while ago, and things were not going well. Just remember the stories from Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, when the Israelites first returned from exile, their hopes were high. They would return and rebuild their lives in the temple. All of the great promises of the prophets would come true. The Messiah would come and set up God's kingdom over a unified Israel and over the nations and bring justice and peace for all. But that's not what happened. The Israelites who repopulated the city proved to be just as unfaithful to God as their ancestors, resulting in poverty and injustice. And so in Malachi, we find out just how corrupt this new generation has become. The book's designed as a series of disputes, and most sections begin with God saying something, making a claim or an accusation, and then Israel will disagree or question God's statement. And then God will respond and offer the last word. This happens 6 times. In the first 3 disputes, God exposes Israel's corruption, and in the final 3 disputes, he confronts their corruption. And the overall impression you get from these arguments and disputes is that the exile fundamentally didn't change anything in the people. Israel's hearts are as hard as ever. The first dispute starts when God says that he still loves his covenant people despite their failures. And Israel rudely objects, saying, "How have you shown us any love?" And so God reminds them of how he graciously chose the family of Jacob, their ancestor, to become the carrier of God's covenant promises, instead of Esau, his brother, and the family that came from him, who eventually came to ruin. Remember the stories from Genesis and the book of Obadiah. And so right from this first dispute, Israel is exposed as suspicious, doubting God's love and faithfulness. The second dispute exposes a problem with Israel's second temple. God accuses the people of despising and defiling the temple. And the people fire back, "How have we despised you?" And so God responds by focusing on the people, how they're bringing shamefully lame offerings of these sick, blemished animals that show that they don't value or honor their God. But it's not just the people, it's the priests too who run the temple. They not only tolerate but participate in these corrupt forms of worship. From top to bottom, God's people have proven faithless. In the third dispute, God accuses the Israelite men of treachery against him and their wives, which of course they deny. And God exposes the toxic combination of idolatry and divorce taking place. You have Israelite men marrying non-Israelite women and then adopting the worship of their wives' ancestral gods into their homes. Remember the story from Nehemiah chapter 13. And so Malachi connects this to a wave of men divorcing their wives for no good reason. And the people are all fine with this. And Malachi says, no, it's a betrayal of your covenant with God.
Pretty heavy, huh? It says it's a betrayal of their covenant with God. So let's get into the meat. Malachi chapter 2, starting at verse 10. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to this chapter. And we're reading this, by the way, out of the Message version. That's what MSG stands for. It's not something we're putting in your coffee. MSG means the Message version. Typically, we use the New International Version, which is the NIV. But this morning, we're going to be reading from the Message version of it. Malachi chapter 2, verse 10. So Malachi says to the people, don't we all come from one Father? And aren't we all created by the same God? So why can't we all get along? Sounds like something my dad used to say to my brother and I. Why do we desecrate the covenant of our ancestors that binds us together? So he's speaking about the covenant relationship that God has with the people of Israel. And he's saying, this is the community that we have this covenant with. And you guys are like totally at each other's throats. And he's saying that's not how it should be. He goes on in verse 11 and says, Judah has cheated on God in a sickening violation of trust in Israel and Jerusalem. Judah has desecrated the holiness of God by falling in love and running off with foreign women who worship alien gods, and God's curse is on those who do this. He says to them, drive them out of the house and home. They're no longer fit to be part of the community. Again, the covenant community that was designed to worship Yahweh, God, the true God. And he says, no matter how many offerings they bring to the God of the angel armies. And that is Eugene Peterson's the one who wrote the Message version. That's his way of communicating the word Yahweh, which is the covenant God name. He goes on in verse 13 and says, and here's the second offense. You fill the place of worship with your whining and sniveling because you don't get what you want from God. He says, do you know why? So he's starting this dialogue. He says, it's simple. Because God was there with you as a witness when you spoke your marriage vows to your young bride. And now you've broken those vows. You've broken the faith bond with your vowed companion, your covenant wife. God, not you, made marriage. And his spirit inhabits even the smallest details of marriage. I had to read that a few times this week as I was studying. I thought, what a fascinating verse. That God is involved in the very smallest of details of your marriage. And he says, and what does he want from marriage? Well, children of God, that's what. Again, speaking to the Israelites some 2,500 years ago, again, the covenant people to continue that lineage on. And he says, now this, which is profound, guard the spirit of marriage within you. Don't cheat on your spouse. And in verse 16, then he says, I hate divorce, says the God of Israel. It's interesting that Malachi puts that phrase in there because he says, I hate divorce, and he's making sure they understand that's not his opinion. He says the God of Israel. I thought about this as I was reading this. Honestly, nobody loves divorce. I mean, nobody does. God doesn't hate people who have been in divorce. I think what God hates is the devastation of it. The destruction of the family unit, the broken home, the kids that get caught up in it. And Malachi is addressing, again, several relationships here. Relationships and the disunity within the community, but also relationships as it relates to marriage. And he's addressing both of these. And I think back when I came home one day, I was 8 years old, and I walked into the house, and we used to enter into the side door into our house. We never went through the front door. My dad always had us go through the side door. I remember walking in, and my dad was right there in the laundry room, and he was a big guy, and he was standing kind of in the way, and I walk in from school, and I go, "Oh, what's up?" He says, "Hey, your mom left, and she's never coming back." I was like, "What? Where's the love sandwich?" No, like, I was 8 years old, right? Like, he just bluntly, "Your mom left, she's not coming back." And I'm like, "Well, what happened? Why?" And it was interesting because even now, my recollection as I was thinking about this, I don't ever remember them really fighting. You know, I'm sure they disagreed all the time and there was just different stuff, but in my recollection, I don't remember like there being knockdown dragouts or anything like that. And so it like hit me as just this little guy, like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And it's cute, right? 8-year-old standing in the laundry room. My first response was, "Well, who's going to do the laundry?" And I just remember him explaining, "Well, you know, it's not working out, blah, 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 blah. So you and your brother are going to live here with me." And I just was devastated. I was devastated. Like, my mom, she's not going to be here? I felt very lost, very alone, I didn't have words. And I did what most kids do. I blamed myself. My brother and I, we were Hellions, for sure. But I blamed myself. And for decades, I blamed us. Only until my wife, Lisa, one day I was explaining the divorce to her and telling her about it. And I said, "Yeah, you know," and I flippantly just said, "You know, well, we were Hellions, and, you know, I don't blame her for wanting to leave." And she's like, "Hold up, what?" She goes, wait. Can you rewind that tape for a minute that you've been playing for decades? And so I said it to her, and she goes, "You were 8 for crying out loud. 8. It doesn't matter if you burn the house down." I mean, maybe. Like, she's like, "You were 8 years old." And it like hit me in that moment. You're right. I just was lost. And I had no real model for the family growing up. I didn't really have a model of what the family looked like. And I knew what ours looked like. And in some ways it set me up for failure in future years. And I'm not blaming, because at some point you become an adult and you're responsible for your own decisions. I get all that. I've been through years of therapy, okay? I got it. I get it. But it does set you up in some ways for failure. And I just want to tell you, as we go through this message this morning, you're here. I'm very cognizant of my audience, okay? So whether you've been through a divorce, are going through a divorce, or you're sitting here and you know someone who's going through a divorce or has been through a divorce, regardless of where that's at and where you're at in that whole, thought process, it's really about the trouble and the hardship that comes from it when God makes that statement. God doesn't hate you, whether you are the cause or whether you are the victim or whatever. There's grace, there's forgiveness. And as we get through this message, you'll see the heart of God. Again, he starts this message with, "I love you," right? He's not just doing the sandwich to make you feel good. He really does love you. He really does love me. And so we see in this language of this passage, Malachi, and he finishes with this verse in verse 16 in the same passage. He says, Yahweh, God of the angel armies, he says, "What I hate is the violent dismembering of the one flesh marriage." Again, putting this high priority on marriage, this high priority on the relationship. And he says, so watch yourselves. Don't let your guard down. Don't cheat. And what I love is he's not writing the people off in this passage right here. He's warning them. He's saying, guard yourself, watch your marriage. If you're single this morning, this has everything to do with you too. All of your relationships with your friends, your family, coworkers, whatever. It's all of our relationships. Watch those relationships because of the value of that. And I think one of the things we first have to start watching for is to not allow conflict to creep into our relationships in such a way that it takes over that relationship. I'm not talking about normal disagreements, which we all have, whether we have friends or whether we're in our marriage. Like, it's just normal to have disagreements. Always when somebody tells me, oh, my wife and I, we never fight, I'm like, what, Pinocchio, whoop? No. I get some of you guys are awesome. But, disagreements are normal. And he's not talking about that. I think what's more important is about the disunity, divisiveness, discord, allowing those things to creep into our relationships and just take over. And so it's keeping an eye on those things. It should be like a red flag warning to us. And Malachi says, look, why can't we get along? He's appealing to their senses and saying, look, these relationships that you have are important. And I think sometimes we miss the priority that God puts on unity as a primary goal for us as the church, the people of God. When I say the church, I mean those of us that are gathered together, the ecclesia, the called out ones. We are called by God to do something amazing in this world, and that is to live this life in such a way that we bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. That what we do in this life matters. And when we have conflict, what happens is it tarnishes the light of that to where people can't see that. We're called to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. We're called to not buy into the crud that says there's a difference between the natural and the supernatural. We do this as Christians. We like, oh, this is natural. And then when God does something, it's supernatural. God's involved in all of it as a Christ follower. There is no distinction between the two. He's involved in all the details of your life. I don't want to relegate God to this little box of the supernatural. He's involved in every area of my life, and he wants that shown to a world around us. And when we have conflict in our relationships, it tarnishes that. Jesus, the night before he was arrested and crucified, had a lot of very important things to say. In John chapters 14, 15, 16, 17, he has a lot to say about a number of subjects before he's about to die. I guarantee one of those subjects was, hey, did you hate how the Chargers lost to Oakland again this week? They did, by the way. That's not what he's going to talk about. Like, if you were going to die tomorrow, what are you going to talk about? Something super important that matters to you. And so Jesus, right before he dies, he says, look, I pray for you and those who believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one. That all of them may be one. That Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. He's talking about unity, the relational unity, the community that God has called us to. And so he's saying, guard against conflict taking over those relationships and not allowing other interests, and in this case, in this passage, these other gods. As these men were marrying other women who worshiped ancestral gods, they would draw them and their hearts away from the covenant of worshiping God to worshiping these false gods. Now, most of us aren't going to carve a little wooden idol and go worship it, but there's so many things in our lives and interests that can take and draw our hearts away from God. And he's saying, look, be careful to not compromise those, especially in your relationships. Especially in your relationships. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart is. As a pastor, so many times people that I talk to and I'm helping, they're in the throes of things and they're reaching out because we need each other. We absolutely need each other in relationships. And if we haven't built those relationships, either through life groups or different people in our church family, what happens is when the pressure hits and when life hits, you're grasping because those people aren't in your life. It's too late at that point. That's why we'll always encourage you to develop Christ-centered relationships. Have somebody ahead of you, alongside of you, and behind you in this walk in Christ. You've got to have those people, and you got to develop those relationships now, because when it hits, it's too late. And so we have to value those relationships. Malachi is saying, look, you guys, you cheated on God. It was a violation of trust. You desecrated the holiness of God, and you ran off with these foreign women, in this case, who worshiped alien gods and drew their hearts away from them in this violation of trust. Those are words we use with people we love, our kids, when they do something. It's like, hey, you violated my trust, right? And Malachi's appealing to them and just saying, hey, listen, this is important. There's so many different ways that sometimes when I think about this violation of trust, and I think about how we are with God, and, just kind of bringing this home for a minute. And, well, I think when I'm doing something secretly and I don't want to share about it, that's a good indication that maybe I'm doing something that's violating the trust of God, right? You think about your life. What are those areas? Every time you commit a certain behavior, there's this conviction and guilt inside, that's God trying to talk to you when it comes to your life, right? That guilt and conviction isn't to make you feel like crud. He's trying to talk to you. There's remorse and regret after something you do, or there's a decrease in spiritual self-awareness, or the voice of God is no longer active. You read the Bible and there's no oomph to it, right? There's no, wow, God's speaking to me today. It's just this drift away from God. And Malachi is trying to tell the people, look, guys, don't drift. Be careful in all of your relationships. And then he hones in right now on marriage specifically. He gets to verse 14. And the people were wondering, why is God not blessing us? And he says, because God was there as a witness when you spoke your marriage vows to your young bride, and now you've broken those vows. You've broken the faith bond with your vowed companion, your covenant wife. This language is reflecting the high value that God puts on marriage. Ladies, don't just blame men. It goes both ways for all of us. God's saying that the vows that we have all spoken to each other in marriage matter. Those words aren't just words that some pastor was up front and you guys were both standing there and saying, and those rings that you put on, which I forgot mine today. Lisa, if you're watching Facebook, by the way, she's sick too. Pray for our family. We feel like been hit with the plague over the last 30 days. Oops. You guys forgive me? Thank you. Right? It's not just that. It's more than that, right? There's a value that God puts on that. It was interesting. Not only did I experience divorce as a kid, but then I went through a divorce. I married in my 20s, 1989, and that lasted about 9 years. And that divorce was horrible, and it was the ultimate end of it. I mean, there was obviously two parts to every argument as they go through the years. You know how this works in a marriage, right? One person isn't always right? My wife always says, Lisa always says, she says, no matter how flat you make a pancake, there's always two sides, right? But in my first marriage, there were some horrible decisions that was made by my ex, and so that played out into a divorce. And I remember thinking, wow, I remember when my parents got divorced, I was like, I'll never let that happen to me. But it did. And I felt lonely. I felt lost. It's just, all these things that flood your mind, and angry, and how did this happen? And right? How could she do this? Right? All these things that flood your life. I know God loves me still. God still loves me. He forgives me. He forgives her. But it doesn't take the pain away. It doesn't take the hardship away. And I just want to tell you this morning, if you're in the throes of dealing with divorce or have been recently divorced, God also still loves you. God loves you. This isn't about condemnation. But what God's heart breaks for is this. He breaks because he knows the pain that's going to happen. He knows the anger, the abuse, the mistakes, the struggle with just even friends that have to now pick who they're going to be friends with. Like all of the trauma and drama that takes place in it. And what God's saying is like, I don't want that to happen. I don't want that to happen to you. And we take God's ideal and we pull it down into our real of what we're going through. But God has this high value on marriage and doesn't want to see divorce in our lives. He wants us to work it out. He wants us to understand that unity is a main goal of marriage and the church. And he wants to bring healing. And so I want to turn this message this morning and talk just for a few more minutes about how you and I can nourish the relationships in our lives so that they honor God. Just a couple of quick things on how you and I can honor God in all of our relationships in our life. And I think the first thing is that God's love has to be the motive and the model for our lives. The love of Christ in us. Because again, when this is right, this is right. When our relationship with God is right, then it helps us put the horizontal relationships right. You can't get that out of order. Jesus said this, my command is that you love each other as I have loved you. That greater has no love than this, that he laid down his life, that we lay down our lives for one's friends, that we're willing to sacrifice and lay down our life. Jesus said all of the law and all of the prophets hang on these two commands. And so the greatest role model, I think, is Jesus when we think about that. He is the perfect expression of love and how you and I can learn from Jesus and how he did life with his friends. There's some amazing stories in the Gospels in the New Testament in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A lot of relationships that Jesus had while he walked this earth with his family, with his disciples. There was one family in particular that Jesus was very close with. And as you read the accounts of how he interacted with these two sisters and a brother, Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus, you get this picture that he was very close with them. Not just because he was the Savior, but because familial, just friends with them. He would eat at their house. Many times he would go there to just kind of get away from the crowd. These were people that were special to him. And Jesus spent time with them. And what was interesting is that relationship, like all relationships, got tested. All relationships get tested at some point. And this happened to Jesus and Martha and Mary. And what I love as we look at the life of Jesus is that he leaned into that relationship. And that's true for all of us, that we lean into the tension. Lean into the tension, not lean back. When things are going tough, when circumstances are hard in our relationships, in our marriages, that we don't push away, that we don't take the easy way, oh, this is uncomfortable. Here's the thing, guys, we don't check out. Because it's super easy to check out. Checking out can look a number of ways. Sometimes we check out with a glass of red wine or a beer or 6. Sometimes we check out because we don't talk. There's a lot of ways we can check out. Jesus leans in because the story goes on about how Jesus was in another town and Lazarus is falling sick and he's dying. And Martha and Mary send word to Jesus and says, hey, you need to come back and come heal our brother. Like, I've watched you heal all kinds of people. Come back and help. And Jesus knew what he was going to do. He knew Lazarus was going to die, and he knew he was going to raise him from the dead and do this amazing miracle. So he doesn't leave. He just hangs out and finishes what he's doing. Again, he's God. He knows what he's doing. The sisters don't get it. They're like, he's not coming. And then Lazarus dies. Then Jesus leaves the town and comes to Bethany. And as he's walking in town, he's on the road, and Martha hears that he's coming, and she leaves her house and goes to Jesus like, what's up? Like, we called you days ago, and now you're coming. Like, what happened? And Jesus has this wonderful dialogue with her and says to her, do you believe in the resurrection? And she's like, well, yeah, one day, someday in the future, we're all going to resurrect. And he's like, no, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will never die. Do you believe this, Martha? She's like, yeah. And then Mary shows up and she's like, where were you? Like, they're mad at him, right? But Jesus is pushing into the tension because he's wanting them to see what's going on. And for you and I, we have to push into the tension when things are going crazy in our relationships. We have to be willing to go all in. We have to be willing to kind of talk about it and not just give up or check out. Lisa and I, we've been married. We just celebrated our 17th anniversary. And so we've been married 17 years, and one of the things that I really was very cognizant of is that I brought to this relationship a whole lot of baggage. And so do you. She had a big old suitcase, and I had like a whole bell cart full of them. So I brought one of these suitcases with me because I got baggage. We all got baggage when we come into a relationship. And this baggage looks like something. I know when I open this up, this baggage, one of the things is in here is some dirty laundry. Man, we got some dirty laundry in here, right? Things we don't want people to see or smell in our lives. Things in the past that we don't want them to know about. We got memories. Oh, yeah. We got lots of memories. All kinds of pictures of things that we've done and people we know and all kinds of memories that absolutely inform our lives and how we deal with each other. We just do. And having, by the way, Lisa has a very similar background as I do. Her parents divorced when she was a kid. Her ex did some horrible things that caused their divorce. And so she's got all kinds of pictures. We both got all kinds of pictures. And I'll tell you, sometimes you're in the heat of battle, you're disagreeing about something, and you'll call her by the ex's name. Don't look at me that way. You know what I'm talking about. We did that. And we said when we first got married, we made a vow. I said, listen, honey, there might come a time where we're like in the heat of it and I call you the other person's name. And she's like, okay, so what are you saying? It's called grace. Because we got a whole lot of baggage. And it's happened. That didn't create another knockdown drag out because we leaned into the tension. We dealt with it. There's other interests. There's like all kinds of stuff in this suitcase. There's things that like when we were younger that all we loved, things that I loved and cared about that took all my time and just everything was all about. It was all about rock and roll, Rolling Stone, woohoo. It's all about music. It was all about Led Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac, The Doors, Rush, AC/DC. Ruled my life. Well, she's not into all that. Hey, we got baggage. And the trick is to lean into the tension, to know that you've got the baggage, because we all have it. We all have this suitcase. Every single one of us. So what are you going to do with it? Now, for Lisa and I'm a little particular about some things. I just am. I was asking her, I go, am I particular? She's like, oh, yes, you are particular about a lot of things. So I was like, oh, okay. So how do you lean into the tension of that? She says, we just do. We'll manage. Now with her, are you kidding me? She has a doctorate degree in arguing. It's called a Juris Doctorate. She's an attorney. Welcome to my world. Are you kidding me? She has a degree in arguing. Good luck with that. But we've learned to lean into the tension. Because here's the thing. We know that we have baggage. We know that there's tension in our marriage. But we're committed to our marriage. We're committed to working it out. And it hasn't been easy. There's been tough times. There was a time we went for 4 or 5 years in counseling. Not because we were about to get a divorce, because we didn't want to. We didn't want to repeat the past. That's okay, by the way. Going to counseling, that's all right. Yes, Jesus can heal anything, but sometimes you need a coach. Guys, you can just call it a coach. How's that? If you don't like the word counseling, you say coach. Get a coach. It's okay. And so we did that for years. But we've learned to lean into it because it's worth it. God's worth it. Our vows are worth it. Our kids are worth it. And so leaning into the conflict actually helps you push through it. So don't quit. Breathe. Don't make any decisions or vows in the heat of the moment. I love what Greg and Aaron Smalley, who are experts in marriage, they were at our Forest Home family camp this past summer. They said this, that unity is the superpower of marriage. Unity is the superpower of marriage. It takes work to work through it. With leaning into the tension also comes empathy, being willing to empathize with the other person, being willing to, understand what they're going through, their feelings, how they feel about things, their vulnerabilities. Because authentic relationships are only half of a relationship. Relationships require authenticity and vulnerability. You can't have one without the other. It requires both, authenticity and vulnerability. Helping our kids navigate pain and frustrations in their life, especially when our kids get older, by the way. When our kids are younger, we're caregivers, then we become parents. As they start hitting their teens, you kind of coach a little bit because they're making their own decisions, so you're kind of guiding and coaching and parenting kind of with it. But then they become adults. How many of you know you have to change how you approach your adult children? Because they're their own human beings at this point. I love the new book out by Jim Burns on how to empathize, how to be there for your adult children. And it's this: doing life with your adult children. Keep your mouth shut and the welcome mat out. Some of you are like, what? You just not need to listen. Sometimes you just need to listen. Invite them over, keep the welcome mat out, and just listen. Don't try to tell them everything, what to do. No, well, Jesus said you need to do it this way in your marriage. No. I was talking to somebody the other day. They're like, well, my child's an adult now, but I'm still going to tell him what Jesus said. I'm like, good luck with that. How about you just show a little love and empathy? We get so hooked on what, we still think they're 10, right? I love that book. It's about empathizing with them. And the last thing is committing time to the relationship. Committing time. It's having this long view of your relationships, whether your marriage or friendships. It's having this long view of a relationship and not willing to pitch it. It's about, I said earlier in the first service, it's about doing time with your wife. And I was like, no, that ain't right. Yeah, you're not doing time in your marriage. I know it may feel that way sometimes. I'm just doing time. Putting in the time, right? Sorry, honey, if you're watching. It's putting in time, quality time, committing time to the relationship, dealing with the conflict, having time to do life together, to have fun together, to work things out. Our relationships are worth it. God will honor your life when we honor him and we honor our relationships. Pray with me.